Could you start the recording? Okay. So, hello everyone. We are having now our new session of the Eurasian online seminar, which is organized by our faculty at the High School of Economics, the university in Russia. And we're delighted to have a great political thinker and politician of the current times, Mr. Kevin Rudd. Well, let me introduce him officially first. Kevin Rudd was born in Nambour, Queensland. He has a degree in Chinese studies from the Australian National University and is fluent in Mandarin. Before entering politics, he worked as a diplomat, political staff, and public servant. Mr. Rudd joined the Asia Society Institute as its inaugural president in January 2015. And before that, he served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010. Then as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012, before returning as Prime Minister in 2013. Mr. Rudd currently is chair of the board of the International Peace Institute and chair of Sanitation and Water for All. He is a senior fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, a distinguished fellow at Chatham House in London, a distinguished statesman with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and a distinguished fellow at the Paulson Institute in Chicago. Mr. Rudd is a member of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization's group of eminent persons. He served on the International Advisory Board of the Schwarzman Scholars Program of Tsinghua University, which is in China, of course, and is an honorary professor at Peking University. Well, this is the official stuff, but let me tell you three unofficial things that I think distinguishes Mr. Rudd from other contemporary politicians that I know. First, he is an intellectual. Well, there used to be politicians, intellectuals before, but if you look at the current world leaders, you can hardly find one, frankly. So he tries to understand things and forms his own opinions on them, which few people do. And immediately when we began talking today, we began to discuss some philosophic things and politics, and that always happens with him. So the second thing is that he speaks Chinese. When I say he speaks Chinese, I mean really good Chinese. Once I heard him speaking Chinese, in Chinese, making a speech, I think it was Sangshan Forum in Beijing, and I thought, who was that guy actually? He cannot be a politician, really. I thought he was a scholar, a China specialist, but actually, as far as I know, he only spent 1 year in China. So he is a very talented China expert. I really envy his Chinese, frankly. And the third important thing is that he is a religious person, which is also strange in contemporary world. And he speaks about truly Christian perspective on politics, that it should be relative. So if you want to discuss this, I think it would be also very interesting to discuss this with Mr. Rudd. Well, Mr. Rudd, I think that you have some questions already, so maybe make some introductory remarks, and then we'll surely have a lot of questions to you. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander, and greetings from Australia. First of all, at a time like this, when everyone's been going through COVID-19, my first greeting, of course, is to you and all your families, wherever you happen to be joining this seminar from. And I trust you are all well and that your families are well. And for our friends in the Russian Federation, having seen so much of the infection rates in Russia, my thoughts have been with our Russian friends at a difficult time. Let me speak for not more than 10 or 15 minutes to start with, because many colleagues have joined this webinar with a view to engaging in a dialogue, and I think that is better. But what Alexander has done is set me a couple of questions. The first question he has set is, what is the likely shape of the global order in the post-COVID environment, and will there be changes? The second question is, what are the prospects now for US-Chinese competition and confrontation? And the third one, more provocatively, is whose side should we take? The latter is a normative question. So I promise to answer it in a descriptive way, which is how I think countries might line up if it comes to that. So let me spend 5 minutes each on those three questions, and then let's go to a discussion. I think that's a more productive way. On the first question, which is, what will the impact of this crisis be on the global order? Often, I think commentators, journalists, authors, and some international relations expert are always in search of the tipping point, which moves us from one international reality into the next. You will recall in the early days of this crisis that people referred to the outbreak of the virus in China as China's Chernobyl moment, that the failure of America to deal effectively with the crisis at home and abroad has been America's Suez moment. I come from an old-fashioned school of international relations, which says life is much more untidy than that, and international relations much more untidy again. But nonetheless, this crisis, I think, is probably going to have three sets of effects that I would point to. One is the United States will emerge from the COVID crisis deeply damaged, both objectively and subjectively. Objectively, because of the huge hit to the American economy, which is of an order of magnitude which I do not think people have fully computed at this stage. And it is not just that that will have an impact on America's future growth, but also have an effect on the way in which America therefore deploys its future budget resources and the extent to which America can continue to sustain its budget outlays into the medium to long-term future. I know there is a school of thought which says that because of the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, and because of now at least a decade's worth of quantitative easing and monetary policy, that the United States can continue to simply print money. Ultimately, however, this is not a permanently sustainable arrangement. And the magnitude of economic damage which has been inflicted by this crisis will, I think, have an effect over the decade ahead. I think the second major damage to America is, of course, the fact that the American political system is becoming more internally divided, I think, than at any time that we can recall in the post-war period. And that is before we've seen the most recent outbreak of violence concerning the killing of African Americans by American police officers. But simply the dynamics of the Trump presidency has torn the fabric of American domestic politics down the middle. And the reality is, as someone who has lived in the States for the last 5 years, as I do, and my colleagues are all American, and I travel the country quite a lot. The ability for the body politic in the United States to come together on the question of America's future place in the world and what that should be is becoming increasingly challenged. That's the second point. And of course, the third one, I think, about America has been the damage to America's global reputation by virtue of being incapable of handling the public health crisis at home, and frankly, being absent from the field completely in the global leadership in dealing with the crisis internationally, either as a global public health crisis or as a challenge to the global economy. It's as if the world for the first time saw what America First meant in practice, and that is that America turned completely inwards and as a consequence suffered, I think, significant reputational damage, which continues to be the case. Therefore, America emerges from this crisis, irrespective of the outcome of the November presidential elections, in a wounded state. If the Democrats win, the team which Biden is likely to assemble around him will be a highly professional team, and they do have a capacity to change course. If Trump wins, the judgment I would make is that the current trajectory is likely to continue. However, when we look at the impact of COVID, it is often assumed that America down, therefore China up. That's not my conclusion at all. I see China, in fact, as having been equally damaged by this crisis, and in some ways which are the same and others which are different. I've written about this about 3 weeks ago in the American Foreign Affairs magazine, for those of you who wish to read my written reflections on this. So what's been the damage to China? China in 2020 will have the worst growth numbers that it's had since the Cultural Revolution almost half a century ago. This makes it impossible for Xi Jinping to deliver on the first pillar of his China dream, which is a quadrupling of Chinese GDP by 2020 against 2000 standards. It also creates significant problems in terms of the trajectory for China's economic recovery, given that there will be no early recovery of external demand for Chinese goods in the global economy. And therefore, when you look at China's most optimistic projections for growth in 2020, hovering around zero, the Chinese themselves internally conceding perhaps 1.5 or 2, but those of us who study the Chinese economy professionally or semi-professionally, you look at the IMF's projections, see it as bumping along the ground. This is actually unknown in the post-reform period of post-78. This is a new reality. And therefore, within Chinese politics, in a manner resonant of what's going on in the United States, there is a high degree of internal debate and division as to how this crisis came about. What went wrong in terms of the initial handling of the crisis in Hubei and in Wuhan? And furthermore, can the economic damage be contained? And furthermore, is, quote, Xi Jinping's leadership style the problem here because of the non-effective transfer of information from the provinces to the center for fear that local officials would be punished for simply being candid? These debates are frankly rolling around the Chinese body politic. And even some of those debates you see not just in Chinese social media, but through various internal reports which are leaked into the international Chinese media. What's the impact on Xi Jinping's leadership standing? It's too early to tell. His re-elect is not due until the 20th Party Congress at the end of 2022, and we are more than 2 years away from that. But I think any realist political analyst would conclude that notwithstanding the effectiveness of China's handling of the crisis once it had erupted, and the draconian measures to contain it by and large to Wuhan and Hubei, that Xi Jinping still emerges with damage to himself personally. And there are many external manifestations of that. My final point about why China emerges in a damaged state from the crisis is the reputational damage it too has suffered, given that the virus did come out of Wuhan and did come out of Hubei. And while China's corona virus aid diplomacy has been formidable across the world, the $2 billion package announced recently by Xi Jinping with the World Health Organization, together with other initiatives bilaterally with countries suffering from COVID around the world. In the court of international public opinion, there are deep questions, not just in Western countries, but around the world, as to how this managed to erupt out of China and create a massive torpedo to the global economy. We are now seeing countries assemble $9 trillion US in fiscal stimulus. That's about 13% of global GDP. We've never had anything like that since the Second World War. And so China does not emerge in an undamaged state as well. My third point about the shape of the international order that comes out of the COVID crisis is this, is that the institutions of global governance themselves, whether it's through the United Nations system, the World Health Organization, but the other institutions as well, of, let's call it the global multilateral system, are becoming progressively dysfunctional. And one of the reasons for that is that they're becoming increasingly the subject of bifurcation on geopolitical lines. The case study, of course, which is clearest, is what's unfolding within the World Trade Organization. But in many respects, with America abandoning various multilateral institutions or defunding them, and China partly funding them, but not assuming any leadership position in them, we're beginning to see the institutions of global governance becoming increasingly dysfunctional. It's not just the WHO. Over the last couple of years, it's been the World Trade Organization as well. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change speaks for itself. America torpedoing of the JCPOA in terms of the Iranian nuclear deal. This is happening across the fabric of our global institutions. There are, of course, a couple of standouts. The IMF, so far, the International Monetary Fund, continues to function at a professional level. So too does the Financial Stability Board under the G20 apparatus to continue to provide the interventions necessary to prevent the current global economic crisis from metastasizing into a global financial crisis. But if I see a trend line emerging, it's for the institutions themselves to become increasingly dysfunctional. What I concluded along these lines in the piece I wrote recently for Foreign Affairs magazine in the United States was that we are increasingly seeing evidence of a damaged America, a damaged China, damaged global institutions, and what I described there somewhat provocatively as the slow and steady drift to what I call as various forms of international anarchy. For those of us who are students of international relations theory and the realist school, as realists would argue that anarchy, in fact, is the natural state of things, that order is episodic and temporary, and that we are coming to the end of a period of post-45 or even post-Cold War order. But I begin to find evidence that, let's put it in these simple terms, no one is in charge anymore, no one is in control anymore, nor are the institutions in control either. Now, let me go to the second question I said I'd address, and I'll finish with this second question, and we'll take the rest in Q&A. The second question which Alexander asked me to address was, what are the prospects for US-China relations, US-China strategic competition, and now confrontation? And what are the underlying generating factors? I think there are two sets of factors at work here. One is structural, which all of you in this seminar are familiar with. And the structural factors have to do with the change in the balance of power between China and the United States over time. Firstly, regionally, in regional geopolitical terms. Secondly, in global economic terms. And then thirdly, increasingly, we see it in other international domains as well. And it has been really over the last 3 years since the United States released its national security strategy in November of 2017 that we've seen an eventual China-American response to China's rising power when the United States formally declared an era of new strategic competition between China and the US, that the age of strategic engagement was over because it had failed to produce the desired changes in Chinese international or domestic posture that America had long assumed through 40 years of engagement. The other point that I discover in US reflections on this is that while that has been a Republican conclusion under the Trump administration, in the national security strategy of late 17, in the national defense strategy of early 18, it is very difficult to find any dissenting voices among leading US Democrats to that conclusion either. In fact, if you spend as much time around Capitol Hill as I do with my think tank, the standard refrain from Democrats on Capitol Hill is that there's only one thing we agree with as president on, and that is doubling down against China. Of course, that was prior to the COVID eruption and the peculiar politics in the US, which has arisen since then as well. But my overall point is that for these structural reasons and changes in the balance of power, you have the inevitable emergence of an American reaction. We've seen evidence of that in the last 3 years. If the Democrats win, expect also a doctrinal framework of strategic competition and consideration of other forms of American action against what they see as Chinese assertiveness in all domains around the world. We can come to that in the Q&A. But beyond those structural factors, there is also let's call it the more subjective factors alive in the US-China relationship, which are at play as well. And here, of course, we go to the leadership politics of Xi Jinping. Now, those of us who are students of Xi Jinping, and I have been for some years, and I've been spending the last 6 months researching Xi Jinping's worldview, both his Marxist worldview and his classical Chinese worldview, his integrated worldview. Those of us who look at Chinese leadership politics carefully have identified a significant change in the way in which he views the world compared with his three predecessors, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and Deng Xiaoping. And the changes are relatively clear. First, coming quite early in Xi Jinping period of office, was the formal abandonment of, let's call it, China's defensive posture in international relations and in strategic policy. Deng's cautionary advocacy of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. And a new doctrine, which in Chinese is basically 分发有为, 4 characters, which is a Chinese prescription for an assertive foreign policy, an assertive strategic policy of a type which China was much more cautious about prior to 2013. So this new subjective factor under Xi Jinping's leadership has been evident in the various actions that we've seen in his period in office. One classic case study, of course, is what we have seen with island reclamation in the South China Sea. Another classic example of this is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. But also for those who think that Xi Jinping is a classically cautious Chinese political leader, cautious about international behavior and reactions to it, the fact that we have seen such decisive Chinese measures, as we've seen most recently on Hong Kong with the new national security law in the midst of the COVID crisis, as we have seen in terms of China increasing the temperature over Taiwan, and in terms of the proclamation of new administrative regions in the South China Sea, to me indicate that we have a political leader who does not believe in simply leaving vacuums unattended, who believes in occupying vacuums when they appear. And my final point about the US-China relationship is this. There's been a lot of loose language about whether, in fact, we are already in a new Cold War between China and the United States. Our Russian friends will recall quite clearly what a real Cold War was like, and this is not a Cold War along those lines. If I could give a crude summary of the last Cold War, we had mutually assured destruction at the nuclear level. We had a whole bunch of proxy wars in third countries between the Soviet Union and the United States. We had zero economic engagement between America and the Soviet Union. And we had a fundamental ideological chasm between the two worldviews. Now, China doesn't tick all those boxes. In particular, it does not tick the box concerning the level of American and Chinese economic engagement. And in fact, it's the economic engagement which has actually been the glue which has held these two ginormous powers together for such a long period of time. And even since the trade war in 2018, 2019, the dimensions of the trade relationship, but in particular, the dimensions of the engagement between Chinese and American financial markets, a $5 trillion a year business, has meant that you have this glue which has still held the two countries together. However, the glue is beginning to come unstuck. It is not just the trade war dynamics, despite the Phase 1 agreement signed in Washington in January. It is not just the technology factors, including Huawei and 5G, but the lengthening list of prescribed technologies now moving into computer chips and semiconductors. It's the beginning of evidence coming out of Washington about the need for various levels of financial decoupling, and the directions now given to US public pension funds to no longer invest in Chinese equities. What's Xi Jinping's conclusion about all that? My best understanding, having spoken with Chinese think tanks quite a lot about this, is that China's taken a brutally realistic assumption that economic decoupling initiated by America is underway. And that therefore the best thing for China to do is to begin to prepare for that by becoming increasingly nationally, economically self-reliant as far as its economic strategy is concerned, as far as technology development is concerned, and as far as financial markets are concerned. But furthermore, given that China cannot meet its own requirements in each of those areas, to also look to new forms of relationship with Europe and with Japan, where China has taken a deliberate decision to de-escalate strategic tensions with those two. India is a separate question, which I'm sure we'll come to in the Q&A. So where do we end up, therefore, in the US-China relationship? I have not seen it as bad as this in the 35 years that have elapsed since I first went to Beijing to work as an analyst at the Australian Embassy of Chinese domestic politics in 1984. And my American colleagues and Chinese colleagues agree with that. I've had similar Zoom conferences with them separately, and occasionally I think we could admit together on these subjects over the course of the last 2 months. And so where does it go to? I think the fair summary is this. It feels like not Cold War 2.0, it feels to me like Cold War 1.5. It feels to me as if the political insulation around the US-China relationship and the diplomatic insulation around it has been ripped away. And we're now looking very starkly at a series of economic and strategic and COVID-related tensions, each of which is capable of erupting in a way where the normal calming forces of political relationship and diplomacy would act as a continued glue to the overall relationship. Therefore, we're into a highly unpredictable period. And the thing which worries me most in the 6 months ahead is where do we end up with on Taiwan by year's end? I'll leave my comments there because I've already spoken for 20 minutes or so. I'm happy to proceed to any form of Q&A that you, Alexander, would like to preside over. Thank you for your attention.
Right. Thank you very much for your insightful comments. I wonder if Professor Karaganov wants to make some comments. Actually, could you please write your questions to the chat? I mean, everybody, so that I know them. And then you are welcome to make comments, not just questions, I think, because, yeah, yes, Professor Karaganov, your mic is on now, just keep it like that.
Mr. Rad, it was, honor to have you, but it was also an intellectual pleasure. And many of your ideas were unexpected. And thank you very much for provoking even people like us, though we always like to be provoked. I have two questions. One is who will win? That is what I said eventually. The second question is, you are predicting anarchy, more anarchy than even now, with more competition and with everybody withdrawing. United States, China, and institutions. My big concern over the last years has been that the chance of inadvertent or accidental war is rapidly increasing. I don't think that the United States or China or anybody else wants to start a war. But there are many, if there is anarchy, there are many issues which could erupt and then could escalate. Where do you see their biggest chance? All the more, the chances are, of course, that large because of the chaos, because of the quality of elites, and because of the technical development of military hardware. But where do we have to look attentively for a possibility of a war in order to prevent it? Because Russia will have to, even though if we want to withdraw somewhat, seeing, the chaos, you couldn't get a lot of mileage, but we'll have to do that. Where?
Sure.
Where you would go to try to prevent a conflict from eruption?
Well, let me try and take the second question first, which is, given the current state of the international environment, is conflict more probable? If so, where, and what can be done about it to reduce the risk or to manage crisis escalation? Firstly, Sergei, I agree with you. What I observe in the international environment now is a much more brittle, B-R-I-T-T-L-E, international environment where things are rubbing up against each other now without any insulation. And in particular, I point to the US-China relationship in the midst of that. In my remarks before, I indicated that the normal, as it were, protective covering of political relationships, of professional diplomacy, the resilient fabric of a bilateral relationship, a store of accumulated political capital, it's no longer there to be drawn upon in the US-China relationship. I mean, I speak to our colleagues in Beijing relatively frequently. I can't say I have the same access to the current administration, but I do speak to those around the administration, and I do speak to individuals within the administration. But the bottom line is, this is, as it's described to me by both sides, and that's also my external observation. Second point I'd say is that looking at the content and tonality of China's public language about the US-China relationship, so much of traditional Chinese caution has been abandoned. It's not just listening to the direct and confrontational language of the Chinese foreign policy, Chinese foreign ministry spokesman. It's not just reading the commentary in the Global Times and the People's Daily. It's now across the board in most Chinese elites. And of course, we see the same with Pompeo and the US National Security Advisor as well. And this reached a new threshold with the announcement of various China-related measures by President Trump last Friday. So thirdly, where does this go to in practice, in the next, let's call it 6 months to be practical about this? I think what we can conclude from Xi Jinping's, as I said, bold decision on Hong Kong is a high degree of Chinese self-confidence, irrespective of the damage that China has suffered from the COVID crisis. And the conclusion by Xi Jinping and the leadership is along these lines. We don't care about the American reaction. We don't care about the British reaction. We don't care about the international reaction. We don't care that this is, in the eyes of others, the death of one country, two systems, because we now have national security laws being imposed across the top of Hong Kong coming out of the National People's Congress itself. We Chinese are not going to put up with another round of civil disturbances in Hong Kong. Now, what I find as an analyst intriguing about that is it also reflects a high degree of Chinese confidence about its interests in its near abroad. Turning to the Taiwan question, which is what I'm most concerned about as a triggering point for friction. I think the Trump administration has taken a number of decisions in terms of, let's call it, increasingly officializing the relationship between the US and Taiwan in a manner which frankly would have been unthinkable in the days of the 1970s when Kissinger and Nixon were doing what they did in the normalization of relations with Beijing. I'm not talking about the traditional problems of American arms sales under the Taiwan Relations Act. I'm not talking so much about the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president. I'm not even talking about Taiwan's relatively recent successes in managing COVID-19 domestically. But what I am talking about is the danger of our American friends just crossing the line, perhaps inadvertently, in terms of the de facto official recognition of the Taiwanese state and the active discussions you now see in Washington about possible port visits to Taiwanese ports by US naval units. So what I fear as an analyst is this actually tripwiring into a crisis and there being no diplomatic machinery to manage the crisis. So that would be for me the first candidate. The second would be the traditional incident at sea or in the air over the South China Sea, given recent initiatives taken by Beijing there. I'll leave my comments there.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Sergei Trush has a question. He's an expert on US-China relations in the Russian Academy of Social Sciences. Sergei, where are you?
Just a second, please.
Yes, could you?
So, Professor, yeah, it works.
Thank you, Professor Rad, for your very informative and very thoughtful perspective on the topic of our discussion. There's many questions that I'm eager to ask, but given the time limit, let me ask you about your perspective on development of Russia-Chinese relations as a reaction of the Trump diplomacy. You know, the discussion about the Russian-Chinese detente and Russian-Chinese moving to a more closer military relations are up here for several, probably last 2-3 years. And there is understanding here in Russia among certain section of experts that though Russia and China is not internally feeling harmonic to come into the close military relations, what Trump administration is doing is just moving Russia and China to more closer relations that are not so harmonic to their internal interests, but the external interests are pressuring on Moscow and Beijing to do things they are not be interested to do under other external circumstances. There is understanding that what Trump is doing mainly in arms control sphere is a certain, let's say, a benchmark for Moscow and Beijing how to move on with this relationship. There is understanding that if Trump will be not going to the last benchmark of the strategic arms limitation treaty extension, the possibilities of Moscow-Beijing military coming closer will be higher. What will be your perspective on that? What will be your reflections on that? And how you feel, could it be an instrument to influence Trump diplomacy in general and triangular relationship too? Or you think Trump administration, by manifold factors, will be quite deaf for such instruments of influence? Thank you for your perspective.
Well, thank you, Professor, for that question. Can you still hear me? I've just taken out my device.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
That's good. My battery was running low, so I thought I should charge my machine.
Do you want me to repeat something, or
no? I heard you perfectly.
Okay, fine.
All good. I think the first thing I'd say is I've watched closely what's happened between Moscow and Beijing since 2014. I remember being in Moscow in 2014 in March of that year when the Russian action in Crimea unfolded. In fact, I was there the day it happened. I'd just begun my think tank career. And I remember observing the state of the Russia-China relationship at that time. And as you know, there were certain commonalities of interest that the Russia-China relationship had evolved considerably over previous periods since 1991. And in fact, those of us who looked carefully at the relationship had noticed a thawing in in Soviet-China relations from the late 80s. And certainly by the time that Russia was seeking to move out of Afghanistan. So there's been a trajectory in the Russia-China relationship for those of us who have observed it closely. It wasn't off and then suddenly turned on. And the geopolitics of China's strategic posture towards the then Soviet Union and the Russian Federation in part changed when Russia found itself in an intractable situation in Afghanistan, and then changed fundamentally after 1991. And if you observe Deng's language even in the early 90s, while he was still alive, and certainly Jiang Zemin's and Hu Jintao's. You see through the 90s a progressive thawing in the Russia-China relationship, not becoming strategically intimate, but frankly normalizing quite rapidly. So I think that's the first point I'd make, is that our Chinese friends were never strategically in love with America. They saw the movement under both Nixon and Kissinger as representing a strategic leverage point at a difficult stage of China's relationship with the then Soviet Union, where China feared that it was deeply strategically weak. But once that dynamic had externally changed, as the Soviet Union itself and then the Russian Federation changed, China's strategic view of America and Russia within that triangle changed. And I've traced that considerably with our Chinese friends over the years. That would be my second point. The third is when you look deeply at the nature of the strategic relationship now between Moscow and Beijing, there are profound common interests. We're familiar with what they are. And there are now detailed levels of, let me say, foreign security policy collaboration coordination. Those of us who study the UN Security Council carefully know how that happens. I mean, I see it because I live and work in New York. I've got colleagues who are permanent representatives on the council. We also see an increase in the tempo and intensity and location of Russian and Chinese joint military exercises at sea and on land. This is more intimate than at any other period in the history of the two countries, except for the period 45-49, I suppose. But at the same time, if we go into the current period, China has not represented the complete economic solution to Russia's economic challenges in the period since the United States began imposing sanctions on Russia after Crimea and Ukraine. China has acted positively, but not comprehensively. And certainly my discussion with members of the Duma and elsewhere in Moscow indicated that the China relationship has not represented a nirvana in terms of an economic solution to the problems which have arisen. And as for the energy relationship, as you know, it has its own complexities. And that China has not represented the total salvation to the future of Russian oil and gas exports. And those of us who look at the relationship carefully are also familiar with underlying deep Russian popular concerns about the population imbalance in the Far East, Chinese people movements across the border, authorized or unauthorized. And then you've got the whole COVID crisis coming on top of it, which is, it came out of Wuhan and it came out of China. So nothing is perfect in this world, and nor is the Russia-China relationship. Having said that, the Trump administration has done everything possible, and I agree with your analysis, Professor, to push the two countries closer together. And you could argue that that's a continuation of what actually happened in the last period of Obama as well, in that period between 14 and 16. And that the driving dynamics of what had occurred over Crimea and Ukraine have subsequently been turbocharged in terms of American actions against Chinese strategic interests in East Asia and elsewhere. And so the dynamics pushing both countries, shall we say, to form a single strategic entity in the Eurasian landmass are alive. But the Russian foreign policy and security policy tradition will always have reservations about that. And the Chinese tradition will have reservations about anything which is called an alliance, given what happened with the Soviet-Chinese alliance in the experience of the 1950s and when it was finally terminated in the early 60s. So will this dynamic continue, or will the Americans change course, which is, I think, the heart of your question. Under Trump, I do not believe it will. There is no evidence of that. And I think we're familiar with some of the internal complicating factors of that in terms of Trump's personal relationship with Russia in the past. But I leave this question as an open question, what a Democrat administration would do. The Democrats, interestingly, in my view, have now an open mind about the future of the relationship with Russia. I do not believe this is driven purely out of Chinese necessity. I think it's driven by a range of other factors as well. I think this is a work in progress in the minds of those who would occupy the senior foreign policy and security policy positions within a Biden administration if the Democrats were to win. Now, where that goes on the core questions from Russia's perspective of sanctions, normalization of the Ukraine question, as well as a final level of, shall we say, strategic accommodation in the various theatres where you've found yourself in difficulty in the wider Middle East, not least of which being Syria. Where that dynamic goes under a Biden administration, I cannot predict. But what I can indicate is I think this is now an open question in their mind about where those relationships go. And I say that because the Democrats have not yet finalized their strategic framework for dealing with China, if they win the election either. Now, that for them is an open question. But as I indicated before, the underpinning political sentiment in the United States now, Democrat and Republican, is now one where 83% of all Americans distrust China. And as many of them are Republicans as they are Democrats. And there's a new force alive, therefore, driving American elite politics as well. I'll leave my comments there, Professor. I hope that's partially answered your question.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you very much for these thoughts. Many of us actually study Russian-Chinese relations, so it would be very interesting. Also, you said that there is something is happening in the American politicians' minds, which is also an indication that they have one, which is also, you should know it better because you spend a lot of time in the United States. So,
well, as you know, in Alexander's political system, there are politicians and there are those who have formed administrations. And those who form administrations are often drawn from intelligent ranks of people. So,
right. So we have a whole group of questions. I'm going to combine them. This
sure.
is about other middle way countries, including Australia. What basically, it wasn't one of my questions there, but people want to ask anyway. Let me give the floor to Olga Krasnak, who is a professor at our university, and he formulated it in the best way, I think.
Mr. Root, thank you very much for your time and for your willingness to share of your thoughts about this current situation. So I'm a researcher of diplomatic studies, and I actually had a pleasure to meet you in person maybe a couple of years ago in Seoul when you had your speech at the Korean Diplomatic Academy, and you've been together with Colin Powell and Kang Kyung-hwa, the South Korean foreign minister. So anyway, it was some time ago. And I also published some papers on the Craftfood School of ANU, and I know it's your alma mater. And I'm talking about this not to show off, but to indicate my question. And my question is about Australia and South Korea, the middle power diplomacy, because for these middle power countries, it seems to be a moment, or maybe this moment has already passed, because it's about what to bandwagon into the United States or China, or it's about to make some diplomatic sort of coalitions between middle powers. So what's your take on middle powers diplomacy? Thank you.
What I find interesting, I mean, as you probably know, I've written extensively on this in the past, and that there is a particular role in the international system for what I describe as creative middle power diplomacy. But leave that to one side. Let's look at the current reality. What I find interesting is our French and German friends are seeking to build what they describe as an alliance on multilateralism. What are they trying to do? And I've spoken with both their foreign ministry systems about this. They are trying to provide financial and diplomatic capital in support of the principal institutions of the multilateral system to keep them alive in the current environment. Now, my further argument on that is that middle powers around the world, I think, have a serious structural interest in sustaining the institutions of global governance in as healthy a condition as possible, while great power rivalry between the Chinese and the Americans destabilizes the system. And until China-US relations achieves a new equilibrium, I think the rest of us in the system have a huge interest in preserving as much of the institutions of global governance in a functioning order as possible. I don't think we want to see the disappearance of institutions like the World Trade Organization altogether. I mean, the fact that we've had so much global economic growth for the last 30 years is in part because we've had a norm about free trade. We've had a disputes resolution mechanism working through the WTO. And despite the fact it's flawed, it nonetheless provided architecture. And so too with other institutions of global governance. So I think there's a real role for creative middle power diplomacy, for middle powers around the world to combine their diplomatic capital, their financial capital, and their political muscle to keep these institutions functioning to the greatest extent possible. Is that going to work in the Security Council? No, because that's where you're going to still have a classic 2-1 divide between Russia and China on the one hand, the United States, the United Kingdom on the other. But in the other mainstream institutions, even the G20 on the global economy and financial management, but certainly as far as the IMF is concerned, certainly as far as the WTO is concerned, certainly for the WHO and other institutions, including the UNFCCC, the challenge for middle powers, whether it's the usual suspects, the South Koreans, the Australians, whether it's the Canadians, whether it's the Mexicans, the French, the Germans, and others who are similar, and depending on the mindset at a particular time, our good friends in India as well, then to keep these institutions functioning. Because the fear is if institutions which form the fabric of the current multilateral system actually collapse, as they have before in the days of the League, it's virtually impossible to reconstitute them. And so I call it a form of international triage. You know, the people who work in hospital systems and emergency departments, whose job it is to keep the patient alive until things stabilize. That's where I think there is a role to be played by middle powers in providing triage into the international system. Financially, keeping them running. America's just pulled $400 or $500 million out of the WHO, for example. What's that mean for Burkina Faso tomorrow, for God's sake? I mean, it's horrible. So we've got to fill this gap, but also diplomatically to make sure the institutions continue to function. And that's where I think they must now form a coalition of the policy willing. If colleagues are interested, I wrote on this in The Economist magazine about 1 month ago and called it, it's time for a new multilateral 7 or a multilateral 10 made up of states around the world who are middle powers to cohere around the institutions.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have General Banerjee from India, who wants to ask, a very active participant of our seminar, who wants to ask a question. Go ahead.
Yes, yes, Prime Minister Rudd, we met just a few years ago when your visit to India, and we had a delightful post-dinner dialogue at the High Commissioner's residence. High Commissioner, unfortunately, was no longer present then in India, Peter Verghese, but you told us very eloquently regarding how you saw India-China relations. And coming to that, pursuing that further, which you said you'll leave the question answer session, how do you see India-China relations heading in the future? Right now, as you know, we are having a fairly tense time at the border. 2017, there was this situation in that Doklam region of India-China border. This time, this year's situation is slightly different. More forces are involved in three, four distinctly different areas, and a major confrontation is underway. Though I do expect that this will be resolved sooner than later, short of a major situation escalating. But nevertheless, it's a cause for some tension, and sometimes such tensions, if not handled correctly, could then go out of control and with consequences that are not desirable. How do you see China looking at India, and how do you see China-India relations evolving in this post-COVID-19 era? What are Chinese objectives, and how does it plan to deal with, once again, I think the India-US relations, which are, I think, building up steadily. So what are your views?
Well, thank you very much, General. I do remember our meeting in Delhi, so it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
I hope to get back to India again soon.
Oh, look forward to that.
I'm glad you've raised this question, because I have been puzzled by China's actions on the border in the last month or so. I'll tell you why I'm surprised. Because my conclusion in the period of the last 2 years is that China had taken a deliberate decision internally to normalize 3 sets of relationships. One was with Europe, the second with Japan, and the third with you in India. And there was a reason for that, because in the course of 18 and 19, the Chinese finally concluded that they were looking at a trajectory in the US-China relationship which was heading decisively negative and unlikely to be corrected. And despite the phase 1 trade deal, which was signed on January 14 this year, I actually went to the signing ceremony at the White House in Washington. It was at best a ceasefire. It did not represent any strategic turnaround in the US-China relationship. Xi Jinping is reported to have said internally in about April last year that the Chinese leadership should prepare themselves for American provocation for the next 30 years. And through until, obviously, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic in 2049. And so the reason I say that, General, is that my understanding, having had discussions in Beijing on this, was the Chinese had concluded that the American relationship was slowly dying and becoming more adversarial structurally at all levels, and that's pre-COVID. And therefore, China had to, as realists, remove unnecessary tensions in its other principal external relations. Russia had already been normalized, no problem, simply make it better. Japan, a lot of problems, but make it better. Europe, potential source in terms of capital markets, as well as technology markets, make it a lot better. India, potentially a new market, and some capacity to be relevant to China's technology needs as well, take the temperature down in that relationship as well. So you will remember the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping in China, I think ironically in Wuhan,
Yes,
from memory, in April of
Yes.
18, if my memory serves me well. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
Under which circumstances my playback on that from various officials on both sides of that meeting was that you didn't achieve nirvana in the India-China relationship, but you reached an understanding. And so I assumed, therefore, based on that, that the Chinese strategic interest would be not to allow another Doklam, and in fact to manage border tensions down. And in fact, my expectation would be to see a Chinese initiative to return to the original Zhou Enlai proposal about how you settled it once and for all. Now, so therefore, it just shows you what a bad analyst I am of the India-China relationship, because that had been my expectation. What is my attempted analysis of what's happened now on your border, without having seen, obviously, any of the intelligence material in terms of what's actually happening in detail on the ground? I suspect that given the relatively autonomous nature of the national security system in China, and the PLA system, is that there's been a strategic direction from Xi Jinping to send a message out globally that despite COVID, China will not be taking a single backward step on any territorial matter or national sovereignty matter. Hence the decisions in the South China Sea on the 2 new administrative areas, hence the decision on the national security law as it applies to Hong Kong, hence the change in rhetoric on Taiwan and the removal of the peaceful reunification language from the National People's Congress report in the last 2 weeks, and hence hence the border with you guys. Do I think it's in China's interest to do that? No, I don't. But if you're asking me to analyze where I think it comes from, it's a deep strategic resolve to say to the world, don't think we've become weak because of COVID-19. Quite the reverse. We're in fact going to be pushing in the reverse direction. And so I think we've seen a number of blunt instruments being deployed as a result of that. That's my best answer to your question, General.
Thank you very much indeed. Is it a more assertive China once again then?
At least for the period through until the US presidential elections. I think the next 6 weeks we're likely to see that. Hence in my answer to an earlier question from the professor, my concern about what happens with Taiwan in the next 6 months. Because there are no votes to be had in Chinese domestic politics at the moment by being soft on any national security or territorial sovereignty question. Now, if there's a change of administration in Washington, that will bring about the normal processes of policy review in Beijing. But I think the next 6 months are going to be quite rocky for all of us. And to answer one of the questions which my good friend Karaganov asked before and I failed to answer, if anything starts to really become unhinged in the international system involving China, either with India or with the United States in the South China Sea or in Taiwan, I've got to say it may well fall to our friends in Moscow to work with our friends in Beijing to bring the temperature down, because it's a difficult 6 months I think we're looking at. And I think it's an unwise period for any of us to reach any deep strategic conclusions about the shape of the world from 2021 on by engaging in any intemperate, reckless, or escalatory behavior in the next 6 months, either for the Americans, but also for the Chinese.
Thank you very much indeed, and look forward to seeing you in Delhi sooner than later.
I look forward to be back.
Well, thank you very much. Let's have 2 or 3 more questions, I guess, because so the next one is Marat Galimov, who has a question about Australia, which we don't know here very well. Well, go ahead, Marat.
Yeah, I don't know Australia very well too, but I have a specific question. Does 6+2+N formula of Canberra's diplomatic priorities still hold water, with six referring to China, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, and the United States, 2 meaning East Asia Summit and G20, and N standing for neighboring countries? Thank you in advance, Mr. Rath.
I think the current Australian government, which is not of my political persuasion, I'm from the Australian Labor Party, we currently have a Conservative government in Canberra. So I'll try to be descriptive rather than pejorative. There you go. And that is the current Australian government, in terms of its relationship with China in the region, has sought to identify itself as closely as possible with the strategic priorities of the United States, both in the South China Sea, to some extent over Taiwan, to some extent in terms of Chinese trade policies, and most recently in terms of the public rhetorical debate between Washington and Beijing over the origins of the coronavirus. So the current nature of the Australia-China relationship, I think most analysts in this country will conclude, are very negative. Most analysts in China would agree with that conclusion. The second point is, in Australia's regional diplomacy, which I believe goes to the heart of your question, across the rest of East Asia, its closest relationship under the current Australian government is with Tokyo. That relationship is particularly close and becoming closer. The same cannot be said in terms of Australia's relationship with the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. Now, that's not to say it's an adversarial relationship, but what I'm saying is that it's not, as it were, a relationship of absolute strategic commonality. The relationship between Canberra and Jakarta is strong and is good. The relationship with Singapore is strong and is good. With Malaysia, it is quite strong. Vietnam, it's quite strong. But what is weakest at the moment is the evolution of the regional architecture for engaging China, otherwise called the East Asian Summit, or the various ASEAN Plus arrangements. There's a danger in the current period that the ASEAN regional infrastructure is becoming weaker as it internally becomes more divided. As you know, you have a couple of countries in Southeast Asia, principally Cambodia, but also Laos and some others, who are more likely to argue China's position within Southeast Asia. And by reverse logic, you will have a number of others who will argue a more American position. As a consequence, the institution is becoming somewhat weaker, and therefore the ASEAN Plus arrangements, +3, ASEAN +6, is also becoming somewhat weaker. The East Asian Summit, which brings together the ASEAN's +6, but adding in now the United States and Russia, is perhaps the weakest of all. In fact, the Americans have by and large declined to attend at head of government level. So my overall response would be, not simply as a product of difficulties in Australian diplomacy, but the regional architecture in East Asia right now is the weakest I have seen it, really in the post-75 period. And therefore it has little robustness in dealing with the emerging security tensions now across East Asia. I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you. There's a whole group of questions about basically what the United States can do more about against China, let's say. Some people ask what can they do in Africa. Some people ask if they can recognize Taiwan officially, or somehow contain China in a different way. So, do you think they can do something really to harm China, so that China make concessions?
Well, so far in the United States, apart from the high policy documents of the National Security Strategy of November, December 2017 and National Defence Strategy of early 2018. I do not, as of June 2020, see evidence of a comprehensive American strategy on China. As I've often criticized my American friends in the past, I see a lot of attitude towards China. I don't see a lot of strategy towards China. And as you know, the Russian strategic tradition, there's a big difference between what your attitude is and how you feel about something on the one hand, as opposed to what your strategy might be on the other. In fact, that distinction is alive in most of our foreign policy and strategic community traditions. But as of June 2020, I do not see a lot of strategy. If there is one element of strategy I see beyond, let's call it a rolling rhetorical attack on China by the United States over human rights, over Hong Kong, over Taiwan and the WHO, over COVID and China's COVID diplomacy, etc. Beyond those rhetorical positions, the one operational element of US strategy that I do see is a deep decision to define a dividing line between American allies and, let's call it, China's friends and partners in the world on 5G and on the new cutting-edge technologies in telecommunications and in artificial intelligence, to the extent that the United States can achieve that. That is where I see the core organizing principle emerging in terms of US operational strategy towards China. To the extent to which it's effectively implemented as opposed to ineffectively implemented or crudely implemented, as we saw in the last 2 years over Huawei and 5G, is an open question. But what I do see now is a hardening view in Washington about not just 5G and the advancement of Huawei alternatives in terms of Nokia and Ericsson, but now also as far as computer chips and semiconductors and that entire industry in the future, and beyond that, in the various domains of artificial intelligence. So what do I see emerging from that? Is an increasingly bifurcated world in the organizing technologies of the 21st century. That, I see, is a core element of American operational strategy. Beyond that, I see a lot of tactics, I see a lot of attitude, I see a lot of politics, but if there's an organizing principle at work, it is on the central domain of technology, where the Americans still believe, and perhaps correctly, that they have a remaining advantage in relation to China.
Well, thank you very much. So I think I would like to ask the last question, because our target time is about 1.5 hours, and we don't want to bother our speakers for a longer period. So, and that...
My wife tells me dinner is due here, so I better
so
go and eat. Otherwise I'll be inspired.
I'll ask you a very simple and short question about religion and Christianity. So, what do you mean by Christian perspective on politics and for probably foreign policy in the contemporary world? Because we here can see that, well, first of all, there's an interesting tendency. The people who had religion who experienced a very strong of religion for a long time, they're becoming secular. Europeans, for example, more secular, and probably Australians as well. But I don't know that very well. So, but people who experienced atheistic regimes, they're becoming more and more religious. So that's because people usually want to have whatever they didn't have before. But could that become a kind of basis for value clash, or what role is it going to play in foreign policy? Or do you think you began as a realist, or do you think that only geopolitical and the real things matter? Well, thank you.
I love the way Alexander finishes our discussions on something as simple as that. And that's the most complex and profound question of our entire discussion. A couple of quick observations. I certainly don't belong to the school of thought which says that the role of Christians, whether they're Catholics, Protestants, or Orthodox, is any better or any worse than anyone else in the public political process of any country. That's not my view at all. My view is if you profess a Christian faith, that there is no such thing as a privatized faith, that it has public policy consequences, whether you like it or not. That we do not have a privatized religion, and that when you speak about Christianity, you cannot not therefore talk about poverty. You cannot avoid talking about justice, and even in the current age, you cannot avoid talking about the planet and our responsibility to the global commons. And you cannot avoid talking about the machinery of peace and how that is best achieved, either by realist means or by other means. So these are values which come out of the tradition, which those of us out of, I think, Orthodoxy and those out of Catholic and Protestant Christianity, if we take away some of the superficialities of language, they unite us in a way in which we view things. Secondly, as we look at international relations, for me, as both a former Prime Minister and a Foreign Minister and someone responsible for the development assistance budget, I cannot, as an ethical person, be indifferent to poverty in the world. I cannot be indifferent to it. I've got to do something about it. Now, there's a separate debate in politics and political theory about what you then do. How is this best organized as a base of neoliberal economics, whether it's Marxist economics, whether it's social democratic economics, whether it's Keynesian economics, etc. But we cannot, in the international community, be indifferent to suffering when we see it. We just, if we proclaim ourselves to be Christian. So for me, that is an animating principle which governs people of goodwill from multiple traditions around the world. And this is where I think we ultimately part company, perhaps, with, how do I put this, atheistic materialists who ultimately may have a different view about the intrinsic worth of human beings. We may have a different view. And so finally, where that comes into play for me is that can we, through the Parliament of Humanity, otherwise called the United Nations, dare to believe that we can transcend some of the stuff which divides us on a daily basis, whether it's US-Russia relations or China-US relations, or the usual security dilemmas which characterize international relations practice. Is there a space in all this for some capacity for the Parliament of Humankind, and that is the United Nations, to cause us to see reality as others see it through their own eyes, and then to find a middle path through security and other dilemmas, which do not automatically result in win and loss. So for me, these are rolling ethical questions, which are in part a product of being a student of international relations theory and practice, partly as a political practitioner, but partly as a failed amateur theologian, as I try to reflect on these things. My concluding point, Alexander, is if you go to look at those people who sat down to write the UN Charter, you'll be surprised about how many of them were actually people from different but informed religious traditions. Hindus, Catholics, and others, trying to craft an essential set of values which transcend racial and cultural divides, which are essentially human, which our multiple religious traditions, in its best light, can find common ground for. My concluding point, Alexander, is that in Australia, there are no votes to be had in being a practicing Christian. Zero. Unless you can drink a lot and swear a lot, you're not likely to get elected to much in this country. I'm sure Russia is a much purer, Puritan country than ours.
Thank you very much. Well, now we know that we have a lot in common with Australia, so we can be. Well, actually, I asked this question because I knew very well that international relations is only a very small part of reality that you can hear your opinions on. So I'm very happy that we heard this last answer, because on kind of general things. So,
well, Alexander, final thought on that is that I've always had a view, perhaps it's informed by just being a farm boy from rural Australia, or being from a Christian tradition, that we're all human beings. And I always, as my good friend Karaganov would tell you, I've never been a huge student of the Soviet Union or Russia, but I made a conscious effort to understand Russia over the last 5 to 6 years. I've spent quite a bit of time. And I'm always fascinated by the question of understanding reality through the eyes of others. It's the beginning of wisdom, I think, in politics and international relations. But it also opens up this possibility that without being a romantic idealist, it does provide a grounds for actually getting to the actual essence of what our real differences are, as opposed to those which we imagine. What are our real differences? And I suspect the list is smaller than our respective political processes describe them as being. And if that is informed by some theological reflection, I hope it adds a little bit to our collective wisdom. So I'll leave my comments there, and I will think of you all as I drink a very large glass of Australian red wine in the next 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We are not going to disturb your whatever dinner is it now, I think.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So thank you very much. We are delighted to have you as a speaker here, and we wish that in some time we'll be happy to see you in Moscow again and drink some wine.
Moscow.
Yes, yes. Okay, so thank you. Yes, go ahead. Yes, thank you very much, and see you in Moscow one day.
I look forward to it very much, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.